My name is Peter Mansbridge. I'm with the CBC. Good morning. It's great to be here, and I'm glad you're all along. And I thank Jim for the invitation to join you for this discussion, which I'm very much looking forward to. Before I introduce our panelists, let me try to introduce the topic to you by telling you a few things about my world that border on what is clearly a fascinating subject. And also that I have a strong belief in the idea of this panel, that in fact social media has profoundly altered how people, and especially those in my profession, interact with politics, government, policy development, and the coverage of issues that impact everyone. I think it's obvious that we all agree that the social networking world has been groundbreaking. It's used by millions, if not billions. But in spite of its benefits, it is full of pitfalls, that it should be treated very carefully, and journalists should be, at the very least, wary of the information that often they are seeing, especially in fast-moving stories that impact our world. Now, those are important caveats, and obviously they shouldn't be ignored. But I can stand here today and tell you that I'm, for the purposes of my work, I'm a lot more confident how we in my business use social networking today than even a year ago, even 9 months ago. I think things have changed in our world, just like it's changing in yours. And the impact we can have and we should have, and the impact you have and you should have, has changed as well. In a moment, I'll give you one quick anecdote, but trust me, I could give you many more. We've all watched, witnessed the Arab Spring. It'll come up, I'm sure, in this panel, and it may well have come up already this morning. Unfortunately, I missed the first half of the morning. How it's crossed parts of North Africa and many parts of the Middle East. We've all watched how social networking has helped organize crowds, monitored rallies, witnessed government excesses in response to those crowds, and outed those excesses to the world. But let me tell you about the journalism, which has changed dramatically in the coverage of this story in just the last 9 months, especially since the revolution in Egypt. You know, initially journalists were operating as they often do on big stories, independently of each other, especially with the use of social media. And that created traps. Rumors circulated, errors got in stories, people and news organizations got used. In our world, rumors can have incredible currency, unfortunately. The blend of rumors with facts tends to blur things. People tend to believe what they hear on the street corner and move it on. But sometimes we actually do learn in my business. Instead of ignoring the new world, we, I believe, have adapted to it and are using it to great advantage. Now, and I believe this especially on the part of the best journalists in the world, there's a kind of unwritten deal to ensure accuracy, to challenge the authenticity of, in the case I'll give you, of a tweet, and take it to the next level. Now here's the example. A few months ago, in the kind of middle of the Libya story, assuming we've almost reached the end of the Libya story, which is a dangerous assumption, I would vouch. But a couple of months ago, there was kind of buzz out there, and some of it was hitting the different feeds, that the Israelis were supplying the Libyans, the Gaddafi forces, with weapons, and in particular a special weapon they could use against the insurgents. There was even a picture out there that people were studying, trying to understand whether this was true. And the picture was of a weapon that seemed to have something stamped on the side of it, and it looked like Star of David. Some people were kind of leaping to conclusions based on that, but certainly the word was out there and being talked about. And then one Middle East news agency in Lebanon actually reported it as fact and used the picture as proof. Now, you know what happens when that happens. Other news agencies, not all of them, but other news agencies will start to report on the same thing using the original source, the first news agency, as authenticity. And then it starts to spin almost out of control to the point where within a few days nobody's relating to the original source, they're just saying it as fact. Well, that's not what happened here. And it's interesting to learn from what happened here. When that report came out, and when that picture was being circulated, a fellow by the name of Andy Carvin, he's a journalist with NPR, National Public Radio in the United States, who has a great deal of respect by other journalists in different parts of the world who monitor his work, listen to what he has to say. He started wondering about this picture and trying to figure out whether or not he could authenticate it, because it was unclear to him whether or not that was a Star of David or even what kind of weapon it was. So what did he do? He put it on his Twitter feed, and he encouraged his followers to analyze it and let him know what they thought. Now, this isn't any journalist. This is a fellow who is followed by, I checked last night, over 55,000 people. A wide array of listeners, viewers, readers, other journalists, but also people like you. Policy wonks, think tank, analysts, people who write on the issues that he was covering. And within a very short period of time, this army of followers were offering all sorts of insight, not just the odd, no it isn't, yes it is, but analysis of the picture, of the weapon, of the issue, and getting it to him. In the end, he was able to conclude that this was not a weapon made in Israel, that it wasn't a Star of David, that in fact it was a camel, and it was from India. So think about that for a moment. For Andy Carvin, those were well-informed people who were tapped into for research on a fast-moving story in another part of the world. Watching Carver work that day was, for the journalists who were monitoring his work, was like being in the engine room of a major news organization at its best. On that day, Twitter let you learn, it let you observe, and you were better informed. So that, through a little anecdote, is my take on how the world is changing. Sure, it's a bit simple, perhaps, but think about the impact that moment could have had versus the impact it did have. But I know you're looking for a little deeper thought than that. Unfortunately for you, we have real experts here who are going to take us much further into this issue on a much broader scale. Your reading material properly identifies our panelists today, so I'm going to keep these introductions short and to the point. I've asked Toby Fife to start for us. Toby's the Vice President of the Learning Lab at the Institute on Governance in Ottawa, an Editor-in-Chief of Canadian Government Executive magazine. Toby has a distinguished resume, not the least of which I might add is when he worked for the CBC quite some time ago. Toby, please start us off.
Thank you very much, Peter. When I worked for the CBC, I produced a program called Cross Country Checkup. When the program worked, we thought this was the best example of Canadians talking to Canadians that you could ever have on CBC radio. When it didn't, we always referred to it as the intellectual running sore of Canadian public broadcasting. And it was quite an experience when it didn't, let me tell you that. The approach I want to take, perhaps, to this subject is based on my experience in organizational performance and how government organizations work. In other words, perhaps part of an organizational approach to the use of social media, and relating that to some research I and a colleague did for the Institute of Public Administration of Canada on this issue. So I would suggest that in thinking about the role of think tanks in social media in policy innovation for government, there perhaps are 4 questions that already I get, although I must admit I missed the early part of this, that are roiling around in this room, could perhaps be put as follows. The first becomes, what is the role of the government in the 21st century? The second is, how is policy innovation or policy going to be developed in order to support that role? Third, how will social media contribute? And then last, so how can think tanks benefit or take advantage of that? So I think there's a little dispute that the world of government is changing. You've been hearing about some of the so-called wicked issues, the impacts of which remain unknown. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. Do we really have any idea how government should respond to a number of issues? The rise of the post-industrial service office economy, the fact that the middle class simply can't keep up, aging population, unaffordable cities, immigration, the rise of BRIC, and increased disenchantment with government. A lot of talk always in government circles about this, but I think really there's a sense that no one really knows how we are going to deal with those. If you add to that the fact that the policy environment is changing, in part because of the complexity of issues that are coming more apparent, and from a government point of view, transcend the mandates of governments themselves, of many departments and various sectors. Obviously, issues like climate change, maybe 10 years ago would have been limited to the Ministry of Environment, now involving many other departments. So this has policy implications for government in terms of dealing with that issue, if you like. Secondly, the speed of policy response must be faster. Many drivers of that, one being the 24-hour news cycle, I would suggest. The fact that through obvious technology like the internet nowadays, people have access to information. But it means from a policy perspective, the governments are being driven to respond more quickly. Second, third, I would say that citizens obviously expect more open and participatory approaches to solving present and future day challenges. And politicians are demanding input from outside the public service. And some are putting this down to a lack of trust in public institutions that the politicians have themselves. Others are suggesting that it's partly because governments are starting to stand back and say, we have a certain policy agenda that we expect you to follow. I did an interview with the president of the Treasury Board, Tony Clement, on this one, and I asked him, so what's the main 2 jobs of public servants? And he said, the first is to implement government policy. The second, by the way, is to give us good advice. So what's the value proposition for government? The one I like to use is from the World Economic Forum, because it defines public value as occurring when quality services are delivered, socially desirable outcomes are achieved, Citizens are happy with services and outcomes, and trust in government is created or increased. So you start from that. How does policy innovation occur? Well, if you come back to the notion that government is changing, it kind of depends who you talk to. David Cameron in the UK, the Prime Minister, in his Big Society project, argues that government must move from a default position of central design and service delivery to citizen-driven partnerships. And in this Big Society initiative, he is driving this notion that policy and other activities must occur outside the core of the public service. I mentioned my interview with Tony Clement. I asked him the same question: what's the role for government in the 21st century? And he said it's a convener. What's a convener? I was thinking of some cocktail party, actually, but he said what he sees it doing is bringing together the various sectors, citizen groups, interests, in order to achieve outcomes, and basically argued that Canadians, in his view, don't feel that government has all the answers, should have all the answers, or should even try to deliver on all the answers. Others say that government has to learn how to capitalize on complexity and learn to collaborate, obviously, with other sectors. But the bottom line, it seems to me, is that governments need to back off. They're understanding that they can't control the way they used to, and they have to pursue an integrated approach that engages a wider policy community across other governments and as well as other sectors in order to bring together relevant ideas, insights, and talent to a shared common space. So how does social media contribute? You're going to, and have already, I'm sure, know a lot about what it is, this new way of doing business. I think for organizations, though, they have to look at social media not simply as a tool and a toy and a technology issue, but as a management issue. And the question becomes, how are organizations going to manage these many aspects, if you like, of social media in order to achieve what they want to achieve? And social media is both a driver, I would argue, and an enabler. So how is it a driver? It's obviously empowering and informing citizens and organizations. When I came down in the airplane this morning, there's an article in the business section of the Globe and Mail headlined, "Air Canada Workers Flash the Facebook Wildcard." And the bottom line is that Air Canada, you may know, the support personnel might be going out on strike, and they've created a Facebook that page that is not only embarrassing Air Canada. What's really interesting about this is it's embarrassing their own union leaders and forcing, and according to this, making it more difficult to reach a conclusion at the bargaining table. So fascinating example of how empowerment from the ground up is being used through social media. I think what it means then is forcing governments, in this case forming obviously the business, to think about issues around inclusion. And I mentioned that these as a driver, and obviously social media are driving and promoting cultural change in these large silo-driven organizations where decision-making is typically top-down. As an enabler, you all know that social media is providing many of the tools that allow all organizations to connect and collaborate. So my fourth point was, how can think tanks take advantage of this situation? My premise when I walked in is obviously think tanks want to participate and influence the government policy-making process. Other issues that came up in your earlier speaker related to they want to remain relevant and they want to pursue an evidence-based approach. So specifically, I would suggest their real value to the World Economic Forum value proposition for governments is that they can co-produce value. And they can do it to ensure that socially desirable outcomes are achieved, citizens are happy with services and outcomes, and trust in government is created or increased. Think about the future. The use of social media will outstrip the use of regular computers by 2013. And know that the government, in its own way, has already figured out many elements of how it can utilize social media for its own purposes. One example was the copyright legislation discussion that went on last year. and Industry Canada set up a whole social media, internet strategy on this. But one of the real reasons it did it is because it wanted to become the go-to site. It was very worried that interest groups were going to become the go-to site for debate on the various issues related to copyright. So they had figured it out and were going to use social media and for their own purposes. In foreign affairs, they're experimenting with an internal wiki. Typically, when a crisis would hit in foreign affairs, such as Haiti, and this was when this happened, they would communicate by email. With Haiti, they set up a wiki, and the wiki became totally inclusive. Everyone in the department can now sign on to this, and it has now become a way of business. In Singapore, they've got what they call an MGov initiative that's moving toward really based on this stat on social media tools, M's as in mobility. So all of their services and products are going to be available on mobility, on social media tools. I mentioned the Air Canada one. Another example of where empowerment work was PSAC. The union was furious at the government's proposal to get members to accept salary increases in return for reduced severance. Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube No campaign was set up where the members were publicly forcing the union leadership into a position that they perhaps would not have taken. So I'm going to suggest that as organizations, think tanks can respond in two ways, both strategically, if you like, and organizationally. Strategically, figure out that if you're going to start investing in this, you have to do it right. When I was talking to a group of foreign public servants in Ottawa, a UK, not a permanent secretary, but under a permanent secretary, described his boss saying on a Friday, make it up, I want a blog. And by Monday, the darn thing had to be set up. And by Tuesday, it became clear that this was going to be a catch point for every complaint and every piece of discontent that everyone in the department felt, and they had no capacity to manage it. In short, they had not done this strategically. They had simply done it on a whim because the permanent secretary, the deputy head, figured at the time it was the thing to do. So be strategic. I simply look at it.
I think they're trying to warn you that you have 1 minute left.
Boy, that's powerful.
This is the new media coming into action here.
David, maybe you can, or Chad, sorry, maybe you can pass your mic down.
Just three thoughts.
My minutes too.
No.
Yeah, we won't count against you.
When, for me, I think it's fairly simple. You could make it as complex as you want, but the different tools do have different purposes. And I think probably organizations like yours will want to use them either to listen in order to bring in research to better understand what's out there, to talk for purposes of branding and getting the messages out, and to leverage like-minded thinkers to engage. Organizationally, I think think tanks need to create their own organizational 2.0 culture. You will find a duality of people who like it and people who don't, and that their greatest impediment is to the middle management layer that is nervous about risk and nervous about trust. So the goal at the end of the day will be to strategically implement social media appropriately and to make your organization, if you like, social media savvy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Toby. I'd like to move to Besma Momani now, who's been very busy as a senior player here at CG since she joined in 2004. And she's become a person to listen to, especially with her analysis throughout the media and throughout your world following the 2008 financial crisis. It's a good thing we wrestled that to the ground and that's all over now, right? She's been a lead coordinator for a project co-organized with New Rules for Global Finance. She's also been a sought-after commentator, especially this year on the Arab Spring issues, and she certainly helped us out on that. Besma.
you. I will talk about the Arab Spring because I think it's high on my mind, and I think for many people, social media and its connection to the Middle East, we saw clearly many attributing what has happened in the Middle East over the past few months as really a Facebook revolution, some calling it Twitter revolutions and the like. But first I wanted to... Okay. Did I lose the sound? I think I did.
I hope so.
Is it still there? Okay.
Maybe just move it in a touch there.
Yeah. So I wanted to contextualize social media, and I think this is really important. You know, in trying to reflect on this, you know, I think there is an argument to be made that social media fills some sort of gap in our lives. And in wrestling with this, I was trying to figure out what is it really about in our society and other societies, and what can we sort of find that contextualizes it from place to place. And I do think it's different, and that gap, that social, or if you should say that gap that the social media is trying to fill differs from one place to another. So bear with me here, because I think that, you know, North American societies, if you're like me, it's all work and no play. And so social media fills this gap for us. You know, we converse through social media, we exchange quickly, we socialize quickly. It's all, if you will, used for play in our very busy lifestyle as much as possible. And yet, in authoritarian societies, and particularly for much of the Middle East, this really took on a more political aspect for this very reason, because the gap for them was to find a free and safe place, public space for dialogue about political issues. And so what we saw in the Middle East was really quite unique and elevated, I think, the political value of what social media had to offer. And again, it's really important here to point out that in authoritarian societies, there aren't these kinds of comfortable, safe public spaces. And for many, it had, in the Middle East in particular, resorted to going to mosques, which allowed that place for dialogue. And the problem there was often those who, if you will, dominate the dialogue happened to be preachers and did not necessarily converse with their followers. So social media is providing something to the Middle East that's quite unique. It's giving them, again, a safe place, a public space, and I think it has, in my opinion, a greater political value in authoritarian societies than it does perhaps in liberal democracies. I think at the same time, you know, for authoritarian societies where it may have a political value, we should also point out that in, say, socially conservative societies, social media may have a place for allowing sort of an interpersonal aspect where dating and fraternizing, you know, is, if you will, in public more taboo. It allows that sort of outlet. And so let's contextualize social media from context to context, you know, understand that it has a different tool or different application from, you know, one socioeconomic group to another. So I think that, you know, as we look onto the Middle East, and again, that's something that's really on my mind, we're seeing that it's a complement to other types of advances in information communication technology. And we've seen this revolution in information communication technology throughout the Middle East, whether it's through mobile phones, whether it's through the internet, forums like YouTube and online media. All these forms of technology have only enhanced this debate. And I think those who are quick to rush to the judgment that somehow social media is just started a conversation that never existed in the Middle East are really ignoring many of the signs that had been brewing, I think, for a very long time, thanks to things like the internet, mobile phones, satellite televisions. And I think this is just one of many other forums that allowed people to really express their political views. So in addition to the context, I do want to point out there are limits, and I think that we really need to be cautious of the kinds of limits that social media can provide. You know, if there's anything that the Arab Spring, I think, taught us is that, you know, it is much easier for citizens to agree on the overthrow of regime or dictator than to actually agree on what to do next, you know, what the day after, so to speak. And I think social media, you know, plays in that. You know, it has a strong both, you know, coordinating and logistical, if you will, mobilizing effect and getting people to a certain place at a certain time. It allows the frustration to be vented out in very short statements and posts and blogs. It doesn't allow conversation about what to do next, okay? So I think social media, again, can perhaps get more people to the street, but it can't solve the underlying pressing problems of governance. And this, if you will, I think really allows us to be a little I think, proud of what CG and other forms of think tanks and organizations like non-governmental organizations, civil societies, political parties, institutions really are the forums for shaping these ideas of what comes next. So while it's really useful for us to think about social media as harnessing that day of action, that strike or protest, we have to understand that it can't carry on the conversation. I mean, you can put in 140 characters, put on a white shirt, put a white blue flower on, and stand in Tahrir Square. It can't tell you how much government involvement do we want in the market. It can't talk about how much religion do we want in our society. What sort of foreign policy should we have? That needs to be done in institutions that I think have not only the ability to attract professionals and expertise, but also, I think, provide the kind of context that's necessary in making this an intellectual conversation. And that, I think, is really the third and what I think is a related point that I'd like to point out is, what are the depth of exchanges in social media? And I think this is really important. It's something that we have been celebrating, this concept of social media providing, whether it's called citizen journalism, whether it's called sort of the democratization of media. And I'm perhaps a little skeptical about that. I don't know if I want citizen journalism. I'm a bit concerned about having everybody and anybody tweeting and commenting and giving their political voice. And again, this is not to be elitism here, but there are, if you will, a reason why journalists have to abide by certain standards of accountability, responsibility to the public, and unfortunately, poor quality journalism is very dangerous. And one of the things that I think social media, unfortunately, can do is provide a lot of noise. Provide a lot of noise that is, if you will, not good quality, and although I think we all hope that poor quality journalism gets weeded out, I think we only need to look down south to realize there's a lot of really bad quality journalism that continue to survive and are watched by the majority of people in that country. Moving on, I think that high quality exchange is something that we need to focus on, and social media can create noise. I think think tanks and professionals need to help filter out that noise, get rid of the junk. In the famous sort of email age, we were also very happy to have email, 15 years ago, until we discovered that, we get more junk than we get actual real mail. And the junk folder got established, and many of us are quite relieved as a result, and we have filtering tools. We don't have that with social media. We do get a lot of junk, and I think as we try to position an intellectual exchange out there, we need to make sure that that junk finds a proper, if you will, garbage bin and continue the conversation at a more in-depth level. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Besma. Chad Gaffield is one of this country's foremost historians. He was appointed president of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada 5 years ago now. 5 years ago this month, I think. That followed a 20-year span at the University of Ottawa in various areas. Chad.
Thank you so much. I'd just like to take a first minute of my time here just to say happy birthday, bon anniversaire, as we say, to CG. In just a decade, the acronym CG has become part of our vocabulary. It's almost a word, and you hear it not only across Canada, but internationally. And I think it's worth emphasizing just a bit in terms of the leadership of Jim Balsillie, whom we heard from earlier this morning, which was so key, but bringing together all levels of government and so on. And I think it's an important point when we think about this region. It's often thought about as a technologically driven region, innovation and so on in that sense. But in fact, when you think about the magic in this region, I think about the cross-sector collaboration that's involved. You wonder whether the co-op program back in the day at the University of Waterloo really started conversations among leaders across sectors, and whether that was responsible for a lot of the innovation in this area that certainly had technology as part of it, but in a much more robust mix. And I think that's interesting because of the research that we've been doing on clusters. And how does the digital age intersect with people, and how does physical proximity intersect with e-contact and so on. And the interesting research shows that we stay in e-contact with people whom we see once in a while, at least. Very interesting kind of phenomena the magic comes from physical contact as well as e-contact, and I think that's at the heart of this region, so congratulations and what I think CG is up about. The question of social media is obviously at the heart of what we do at the Social Science and Humanities Research Council because it combines that sense of the new technologies with the social, with people, and understanding that this is a human process. And you know, our research feels that's what we focus on. We focus on people, understandings of human thought and behavior in the past and present with a view toward building a better world. And I think our researchers are attempting to come to grips with how does, in fact, our efforts to build a better world, how can we exploit and harness the new technologies, including social media. The example I want to start with, though, is of what has been happening in Iceland over the past year, where you've noticed that they've been crowdsourcing the writing of a new constitution. And I think in terms of thinking about social media and public policy, the notion of writing your country's constitution through crowdsourcing is a pretty interesting transformation. And I'm going to come back to that. Well, you could say, well, Iceland, sure. After the trouble they've had, they're throwing up their hands saying anybody can do better. But my sense is that it's more than that. And I want to suggest to you this morning that there's a deep change underway, that we are now really into the digital age, which is a fundamentally different period, I think, than the preceding at least 2 centuries or so, what we called modernity. And for an historian to emphasize that, I think is something, it takes a lot for us. We're on the side of continuity most of the time. For us to say we're in fact in a new era, but I think so. And my point is that deep conceptual changes are being enabled, accelerated, and influenced by the new technologies. In other words, the new technologies are so important because they're feeding into and enabling and accelerating deep conceptual changes. And that's the main point I'd like to leave you with. I'm going to unpack that quickly in a few different ways and try to explain why. What are these deep conceptual changes and why do the new technologies feed into that and social media become so important? What's different about digital? What do we see happening now that's different? And I'm going to just emphasize 3 things quickly. They've been mentioned before, and then I'll move into the notion of the deep conceptual changes.
Just keep your time limit in mind.
Sure. 3. So public discussion, debate in real time, on the fly, in conversation, linear, multilinear, parallel conversations, and so on, that can all be captured. That's different, and I think it has big implications. 2, not defined by geopolitical borders. The Iceland example is interesting because here's a country attempting to have a conversation, but obviously we can feed into that from anywhere. 3, social media also, I think, is creating new divides. Jim Balsillie alluded to this earlier in terms of, in many ways, maybe the world is getting flatter, but it's also spiky, as we've heard in many cases. But it's also those new kinds of inequalities, watching those Gini coefficients on inequality within societies go up and so on. And my sense, at least, is that those sorts of implications are really part and parcel of the way in which digital is feeding into this new era. So what are how do think tanks fit into all this? Well, first, there is a need, and Besme emphasized this, for authenticity, trustworthiness, the credible sources, worth engaging with, transparent, upfront, informed statements, constrained by evidence at some level, because we do believe in evidence at some level, whether it's inductive, deductive, or abductive reasoning. 2, I still think content is king. I think there is an appetite and a thirst for evidence presented in a dispassionate, nonpartisan way. New insights about the past and present, new ideas, new imaginings. And it seems to me think tanks are obviously have a key role to play in that based on the first part, their authentic trustworthiness and so on. The third one, and Toby alluded to this, the role of filters, as curators, as monitoring at some level, monitoring the crowdsourcing. And I think this is a really key role that people appreciate in terms of the noise. So, and obviously the role of convening, that building on the trustworthy, credible in terms of convening. So let me close in terms of the digital age as a human phenomenon, what's driving, what's really going on here. My sense is that there are three forces that really explain the importance of social media and why we're embracing the digital age. First, a very different view of creativity. For a few hundred years, basically, we thought a small group of people were going to create and the rest of us were going to apply. And now we know, I think we have a much more robust notion of how creativity occurs, and I think we're anxious to tap the entire pool and rethink the role of the expert and how that goes. And I think it goes deep in terms of our curriculum and so on. Secondly, a very different view of diversity. For a few centuries now, we viewed diversity as a problem, something to be solved, and you think about that in multiple ways, whether it's languages for a country, whether it's standards, whether it's in schools and so on. Now we know that diversity is the source of resilience and strength. It needs to be managed, but in fact we want to embrace it. And third, complexity, and we've heard this a lot. I think we've got to understand, though, for a few centuries we had the idea that things might appear to be complex, but in fact there was a simplicity. We had to parcel it out, break it down, and in fact there was an inherent simplicity that we could understand, add it up, and understand the whole. And now we know. Now we're attempting to embrace the notion of nonlinearity, emergent properties, on and on. A very different view of how change occurs and how we can manage in the role of public policy and so on. So in a world of creativity, diversity, and complexity, I think social media are unprecedented enablers which are accelerating the spread of these new perspectives and in turn affecting them in ways that are still emergent. And my sense, at least, is that part of the success of CG thus far has been in helping us embrace this new world of creativity, diversity, and complexity. But obviously we have a long way to go in terms of our policies and practices, in terms of our organization, our economy, our society, our politics, whether it's in Iceland or anywhere. And I look forward to working with all of you and all of our researchers across Canada and internationally to see if we can build the kind of successful societies that are at least in the potential of the digital age. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Chad. The happy birthday message did buy you an extra minute. Jim sent a message up so you could have that. I don't want to put too much pressure on you, Alexandra, but we do want to get to some questions from the floor, and as our last panelist, we're looking forward to your comments. Alexandra Samuel is the director of the Social and Interactive Media Center at Emily Carr University in Vancouver. She's the co-founder and principal of Social Signal, one of the world's most experienced social media agencies. Founded in 2005, Social Signal works with business, government, and nonprofits to build relationships, brand, and issue awareness through online conversation and community. Alexandra.
Thank you. It's interesting, to tackle this question of the role of think tanks and the impact of social media on the world we live in through the lens of policy change, as the question was framed. And I think that's often the starting point, right? When we are asking, well, what impact have think tanks had? Or really, how important is social media? What people are often asking is, show me the policy change, show me the law, show me the government policy, show me the government that works differently. And it really is a lens that we're comfortable with. It's the way think tanks in many cases have been set up to engage with the world. And yet I think if you look at what social media has actually shifted in the past several years, we're not talking about a long time, you'll see that the policy change filter hides more than it reveals about the impact of social media and more broadly social media culture. And that's because the most exciting activities that have happened online are much more spontaneous or self-directed groups of people, small organizations, who are trying not to effect policy, but in many cases to circumvent it. to live in a world where government is no longer the necessary enabler of community change, community growth, economic change. And just to give you a few examples of what I'm talking about, the most obvious one, I think, is copyright. So yes, it's true, the government is doing a consultation on copyright, and they're trying to use social media to engage with that. Well, the reason we need to think about copyright is because the world of the internet doesn't respect that policy anymore. The policy is broken. There's really no capacity for the government to enforce it. There's really no capacity for industry to work through those conventional policy mechanisms for the outcome it wants. And that's because people have self-organized on the internet to create an ever-expanding set of ways to share the content they want to access, regardless of what the prevailing law or prevailing policy environment is. And that's not just, to be clear, it is in fact fair to endow that with some political intent behind it, because whenever you see an effort to constrain that behavior, and the most notorious example was several years ago, the US court system was used to ban some code that was used to share content with people who use Linux machines, and the hacker community found a wide variety of ways to distribute the code, embedding it in songs, in pieces of art, in all sorts of protected forms of speech, specifically so that they wouldn't have to be subject to this policy. So just an attitude that, try and make your policy stick, but good luck with that. More recently and closer to home, we had the case of people tweeting and Facebooking election results in the face of the ban on sharing election news before the polls close. Well, a colleague of mine and I set up a website to track the extent of that activity, and our server literally couldn't keep up with the volume of it. That policy might as well not exist because it's not enforceable anymore, and internet users were explicitly making use of these tools not just to influence the policy, but to demonstrate that that policy was no longer relevant to them or to the way that they were going to live their lives. I should also be clear, I don't think this is always a positive development. Again, in the Canadian context, after the riots in Vancouver, we saw an effort for citizens to organize around the perceived shortcomings of law enforcement and to use social media to identify people who had participated in the riots. And that turned incredibly nasty, with all sorts of racist and bigoted comments being made about the folks whose pictures were being posted online. And in the ensuing debate, I heard one of the folks who set up one of those sites very explicitly say, well, hopefully government will take care of it, but just in case, this is a plan B. So that attitude, which is, social media is our plan B, the internet is our plan B, radically changes the context for those who still focus on policy change as the outcome of interest. Because it's not the outcome of interest for many, many people who live their lives online. And if it's not the outcome of interest, then we have to ask, what is the role of organizations like CG, of other think tanks, of government agencies themselves that are set up to engage with political issues and to enable political change through this very narrow thing we call policy? And the question I would ask is, what are the opportunities that this new phenomenon of policy circumvention and all of the sort of self-organizing efforts of citizens to solve problems more directly for themselves, what's the contribution that think tanks can make to those activities? Because they still need thoughtful input, they still need research, they still need expertise. But we can't pretend that it's all about policy change, because in many cases, policy is really a thing of the past.
Thank you. All right. Okay, I think that there's the opportunity here, from what we've heard, a number of endpoints into this discussion, not the least of which was the last one that Alexandra just made. I've obviously got a couple of things on my mind, but I would rather hear from the floor, first of all, on what is challenging you out of this discussion and what you'd like to hear answered. So if you can get to your question and perhaps point it in the direction of one of the panelists. Be more than happy to hear the former Prime Minister. Prime Minister Campbell, good to see you here.
I always promise I will never talk about the fast. I wanted to pass, but I wanted to make a brief comment about the remark about crowdsourcing in Iceland. And we don't know James Surdesky's stuff, The Wisdom of Crowds, and there's a lot of really great things that happen and there's research that shows that groups are more intelligent than individuals. But we had an exercise in crowdsourcing up to the technological limits of the day during the process of the Charlottetown Accord. I don't know if you remember, but we created these citizens groups, and they were actually selected by lottery. If you were interested in participating, you got selected. The difference between that process and what you're talking about in Iceland was the face-to-face interaction among these random people from different segments of society when they were making their contributions to what should happen to our Constitution. And what was so interesting was how many of them moved their views. The problem with the social media is I think that's a dimension that's missing, and that's what worries me, that there's enormous democratic opportunity to express your view, but not that other wonderful aspect of exchange, the opportunity to grow and change. And I think that's something, and I don't know whether somebody will figure out a way of doing it. I mean, I suppose we could all get on Skype video and look meaningfully into each other's eyes, but it's a dimension that worries me.
Anyone want to tackle that one? John?
Well, I'm happy to hear from people, but there's no doubt that the notion that we go to the internet basically seeking material that confirms where we already are, and there are studies now showing that, you know, the kind of communities get formed and start to coalesce, and the reinforcing starts and so on. So that's it's an interesting phenomenon.
If I can
Yep.
just share, I think there's very clearly a tendency to have rant versus rant kinds of conversations online, and I think Twitter in some ways has exacerbated the problem because it really is hard to have a meaningful conversation in 140 character volleys. That said, I have to say I'm frequently and regularly surprised by the quality of conversation, and in particular by that, you know, key outcome you're describing, which is does it change people's minds? And in particular around the social media riot response in Vancouver, when I first raised those issues in a blog post, there was an initial reaction of extreme hostility, of saying, are you trying to let the rioters off the hook? And then a conversation unfolded in about 200, 300 online comments over the course of a week and a half. And people came back and posted that they had read more, they had been thinking more, they had been watching more, and they had changed their minds. And to me, the ability to actually have that conversation take place and for people to acknowledge that they were changing position made me feel a lot more hopeful about the internet's ability to support more meaningful engagement.
The back.
Gordon Smith. I never thought I'd be on Twitter, but thanks to my association with CGIM, I should let you know that this meeting is being tweeted by at least 3 people in the room. I hope nobody's nervous about that. I'm not. I really want to make a comment on a couple of points. First of all, Peter, with respect to journalists, there's all sorts of use being made of Twitter by journalists. Nick Kristof goes into Cairo, he says, I'm coming in, who should I be seeing? The exchange of information with some of the top New York Times correspondents like C.J. Chivers, who really knows his military equipment. So it's quite extraordinary, I think, what's happening. Secondly, I think we haven't probably spent enough time talking about the impact of video, because it is of 140 characters, but in fact 140 characters you can include in that a URL, and that will take you to video on Facebook, and I think the impact of video has been absolutely huge. What we're seeing, and I think Alexander just mentioned this, is creating of networks, new kinds of networks for collaboration. Of course, as has been said, you've got to sort out the wheat from the chaff. In many ways, this takes me back to my earlier days in government when you're dealing with intelligence. There's a lot of, it's raw intelligence. You've got to be able to apply analysis to it, and I agree with that that's exactly the kind of thing that think tanks can do. It's also much more possible than with email to filter junk. You can stop following people who are idiots out there, and there are a few. I think the real question is to what extent can this, this technology be used to create the cloud to street stuff, the Iceland constitution. I'm very interested in this and interested in working with people who are looking at how one can use the social media technology to actually build. I think there's a big question marks about what can be done, but it's a worthy subject. Thank you.
You know, I'm in Gordon's camp on this one. I find the 140 character issue is just doesn't stand up to what is possible within those 140 characters, and I think it points directly, you know, into this room. When I, you know, talk to our people in the field, and when I'm in the field, what you want is you want analysis. You want the kind of thinking that goes on in this room, but you want it fast. Like you want it now. And this year has been, you know, such an example of that. And it's offered. You know, it is offered by just, you know, at the end of the 140 characters, you know, pointing to a website or to a link to proper analysis. And, you know, Gordon's right, the kind of journalists who are now using this, and really the transformation in a year has been nothing short of astounding. A year ago, most journalists weren't quite sure what to do with this tool. And they were kind of all over the map, they were making fun of it, and they were using it, you know, not for good purposes. But now the majority of good journalists, especially foreign correspondents, are depending on it in a way they don't depend on regular news services. It's quite astounding, the transformation that's happened there. So I'm in that camp. Somebody else want to pick up on that point? No, we'll go to the next question. There's one right here in the front of the room. They're just bringing the microphone to you.
Thank you. My name is Enrique Mendizábal. I'll be talking later. I'm an independent researcher. I'll try to bring us back to a more practical bit of think tanks and go back to a word used before, maybe a couple of times, manage. And I think this is why the conversation we're having just now on Twitter. So Twitter is just one of many tools out there. And so there is a disruption in our work, and for think tanks there's a huge disruption in the way we communicate. So we've got to think about how we deal with this, but certainly manage isn't the way forward. We've got to realize that we have to be where people are already, and individuals and small networks and bigger networks will choose the most relevant spaces for their thing, for their enterprise, for their objectives. So one of the things that ODI, where I used to work, online communication manager, Nick Scott, has been doing is thinking about where are people going, and I'll try to put content there. But not necessarily the whole paper, maybe just a few words and a link to where the blog or the paper is. And this is what's happening right now. So people are tweeting about this event, but not putting a whole argument, just putting a little link to where they might find more information. You've also got to realize that online, stuff stays there for much longer. So you need to think about how people are going to find your work 2 years from now, 10 years from now. So it's not just about thinking of I'm communicating now, but I'm communicating to generations to come. And policy change or policy circumvention takes time. So the work we do today for a think tank needs to be put up there for maybe 2 or 3 years from now. And that's another way in which we need to think. We're not just communicating now. And then finally, is again to the point of we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can reuse the wheel. There are loads of different types of ways of going online. And email is probably the most successful one still, the best way of communicating with people online. But there's so many more. So I think for a think tank, a challenge is to see what's out there and be up to speed with what's out there. But not lock itself to any particular way of engaging online, because we don't know what's going to happen in 2 months. Google Plus might actually work. I don't think so. But something might happen and things will change, and we will be locked with a platform, a website, a way of communicating, and not know how to deal with the rest. So I think that is the challenge, to stop thinking of management of the online space, and maybe thinking about navigating it or how to survive it a little bit better.
Does anyone want to pick up on that? No? Okay, right here.
I wanted to come back to Vesma's comment earlier about the lack of mediation. And every journalist I know at some point hates their editor. As a consumer, I buy my newspapers, online or otherwise, based on the quality of the editing. And the aggregators are totally indiscriminate in the way they choose material. So what I search for is a good editor. So this is a call for intermediation.
That's a huge point, because I think, and that's back to the think tank. You know, in the old days, acquisition librarians used to do that. And I think that those sorts of roles, what they call the digital curation and the digital filtering, right? Those are roles that I think people are dying for. You know, we do the Google search, and we're promoting, our researchers are, I think, really advancing our understandings of the semantic web and so on. But I think my sense is still going to be, there's going to be that sense of authenticity, credibility, trustworthiness, the filter, the curation, and so on. I think those are digital roles that we're just beginning to understand how important they are. And my sense is that whoever can get hold of those, whether it's through the newspapers and so on, I think are really going to have a key role to play in terms of how we do have these conversations.
Just over here, we've got quite a few hands up, so let's zip through them as quickly as we can. Yeah.
My name is Patricio Meller. I am from a Chilean think tank. And I got from the panel the following dilemma. Are think tanks and social media competitors, or are think tanks and social media complements? However, my main concern is that if think tanks should really be related to social media, how could ideas and analysis in social media compete with sports, dancing, TV shows? In social media, success is measured by rating. Are we going to measure think tanks' role by rating?
What have you got against dancing? We got some thoughts here? Toby?
Let me perhaps try it this way. It comes back to the notion I was suggesting earlier. I think that organizations have to think about how they're going to deal with the implications of social media in an organized way. So that would imply many things. If you start from Chad's point that social media is creative, diverse, complex, in organizations, I don't know about think tanks, but certainly governments that are essentially hierarchical, are essentially rigid, essentially want to control information. The management challenge, it seems to me, is how you decide from the business case how you are going to invest in this, what you want from it, and how are you going to measure success. Certainly applies, I think, to government, and I would assume it would apply to any organization. It's one thing to sort of say we're going to turn everything loose, and that's got its merits. It also has its risks, and it also suggests that you can't use this in order to achieve the outcomes you want. So that's perhaps how I would approach that issue.
Right here, and then to the back.
In my organization, I'm an evangelist for social media and Twitter, and I think it's worked extremely well for us, but I also have some concerns, and I think those of us who are in the ideas business need to reflect about the balance between engaging in these activities and actually creating and sharing ideas. And I was very interested in a piece by Neil Gabler in the New York Times in August called The Elusive Big Idea. And as we spend more and more time tweeting and on Facebook, we do have less time for big ideas. And my personal response to that has been try to set aside part of each weekend to sit down with a book with all my devices turned off. And I'm actually thinking about encouraging the fellows in my center to do the same. Because I think as much as this is powerful and seductive, there's still only 24 hours in the day, and if we're in the ideas business, we need to use it as a tool and make sure that it doesn't use us.
You don't start twitching with all your devices off or anything? Apparently not. Alexander, do you want to thought on
yes, here I am. I'm obviously not capable of turning my devices off. You know, I hear you on the big idea challenge, and in fact, I am working on a practice of just not reaching for the devices during a less than 5-minute increment. This was passed along by a fellow geek who said, if you just leave yourself, don't reach in the pocket while you're in the line up at the plane. Those little moments are often when those aha, moments come to us. And if we're always on our, iPhone and tweeting in those moments, we don't have them. But the flip side of that is, I think like a lot of people who are in the research world, I do much of my thinking by writing. I don't find it especially intellectually engaging to go and sit on a rock and stare at the sky until God visits me and gives me my next research paper in its entirety. I usually have to actually write it. And one of the beautiful things about the blog as a form is it gives you a place to be half-baked. And I would say I blog 5 days a week, and I've been doing that on, to varying degrees of intensity for 8 years now. And when you write all the time, when you just write and you write and you write, and there are people who are out there engaging with your ideas, and in fact, they write back to you, they leave comments, they point you to other resources that are relevant. Oh, you're writing about that, you should really read so-and-so's piece about. I mean, that drives research. So I don't think that it needs to be a dichotomy. I think the question is, what is your core work? If it's thinking and writing, find the social media activities that support that and forget about Twitter. But I don't think it has to be oppositional.
Right at the back of the room there.
Thank you. Hi, good morning. My name is Greg Franks, and I'm a professional literary artist, and I'm a creative services consultant. And I just wanted to make a couple of comments. One was the idea that that you put forward in your comments, that autocrats in places where where there's dictatorships set up have more to fear than those of us here in liberal democracies. I kind of take issue with that comment, and I think that clear examples like the riots in the UK, which were an economic response, the riot that was mentioned before in Vancouver, and the response afterwards, which was a challenge to the justice system, and even the responses to Jack Layton's death here in Canada, as examples of how people within liberal democracies who have a greater access and greater facility to use that information and that technology to pass around a message and to organize. I would say that as times continue to get harder, especially if we do go into another dip of this recession, that I think actually people in liberal democracies have a great deal to fear from the power of social media to organize people at the grassroots level. So that's the first thing. And the other thing is this idea of trying to establish filters for information that's out there. And I also believe that there's a big problem with that. I mean, you can try to set yourselves up to referee a game that's not happening under rules that you're used to. So go ahead and try, is basically what I'm saying on that. And what we need to do is to find ways to engage all of those people, because what some consider noise, other people consider dialogue. So let's actually tap into the dialogue that's happening that is circumventing the elites that are out there, just like think tanks, that are operating in a way that they're comfortable with. It's time to actually deal with people who are dealing in areas that we are all uncomfortable with.
Vesma, would you like to comment on that?
I think if I could just kind of tie, since it's not on, is it?
It's on
Just tying a few things together. I think, and back to the point about compliments versus competitors, I'd like it to be a compliment, but my real fear is that it's going to become a competitor. And, just to kind of throw some very anecdotal observations out there, but television, for example, which is a mainstay for information for so many of us. I remember growing up with 5 channels, it moved to 12, and I thought, wow, when it moved to 30, what great variety. Why is it that now that I have 100 channels, I feel like there's nothing on of value and quality? I mean, there's excess stuff out there. I think you learn so much more from getting 1 hour of the National, if I may say, Peter, than trying to watch the 24-hour news channel of some stations where I have to hear about the cat in the tree, all these unnecessary things that I say, why is this newsworthy? And I think we have this situation, unfortunately, with excess information. It, if you will, brings on a lot of that junk. And I would rather have quality. I'd rather have 5 channels, know exactly that I'm going to get good quality, than to have so much of this, I think, specialties. The key thing nowadays is specialty channels, which really means, catering to a very small few people who may be watching that show. I'd rather have the days when we had quality programming. And I'm afraid to say there's too much junk out there, whether it's social media and Twitter. And my fear, again, back to this complement versus competitor, is that for us to seek attention, we have to enter into this race to the bottom of quality. In order to keep people listening. For people to listen, we have to tweet to them, we have to be on 24 hours a day, we have to be there commenting at every turn of the moment. And I think this takes away from what, frankly, we should be doing, which is the analysis. And analysis doesn't not only come in 140 characters, but more importantly, it takes time. And I think the pressure on the 24-hour news channel is they don't digest the material, they don't think about it, they don't reflect on it. There is some value in good old-fashioned, PR terms of making that so-called executive decision, executive walk, which means get out of the room, think about it, come back, and then put your position forward. But unfortunately, with the pressures of so much of the social media, it's get it out fast, don't think about it, and I think it's dangerous.
I guess you don't watch the Fireplace channel, eh?
The Swiss Chalet channel.
The Swiss Chalet channel. We're just about out of time. I'm just going to make one final comment, and I think in a way it kind of wraps some of this stuff up. And I think everybody's touched on it in a different way. When I started in journalism, it was 1968. We were still shooting black and white film. And that meant, quite literally, at the end of the day, you had to have your film in the lab in time that would give the laboratory time to process it, literally process the film. Then it would come back to the station and you would edit the film. You would literally cut the film and stick it together. Now, what that meant for foreign correspondents, it usually meant by the time that actually shot their item, had it processed, edited, put it on a plane, sent it to Toronto, got on the air. Sometimes that was a week. For those of us who were in the country, it meant you had a kind of 3-hour gap between when the film had to be in the lab and when it had to be on the air. And in that 3 hours, you'd do some basic journalism. You'd be talking to people on the phone. You'd be talking to analysts. You'd be talking to people who understood the story better than you did. You'd be thoughtfully writing your script. Over the last 40-odd years since then, everything's changed. The landscape's changed, the multi-channel universe, and you won't have me arguing with you about a lot of what's on there, including on some news channels. But the big thing that's changed is this time that's afforded journalists to actually think about what they're going to say. The demand is on them continuously to be there as quickly as possible with cogent thoughts, often done live without ever having written anything, sometimes having never even been to the story, just simply standing in more or less the location. I shudder to think the number of people who've reported on television, not ours, thank God, but I've seen others, from the North Africa story who've never actually been on, been below the top of a building where they stood in front of a camera hour after hour telling you what was happening. And in some cases, what they were telling you was what was being repeated to them on the phone from New York or London or Toronto. That's not journalism. And that's where we have issues. So we're constantly looking for new ways, to do things better. And I think we're finding some in this new world, properly used. But it comes down to speed. And it comes down to speed not just for us, but for you. And I think, Toby mentioned it right out of the gate. I mean, the pressures aren't just on the journalists. The pressures are on people like you who can give us the help we need to analyze faster, produce, print faster, to have your thoughts accessible quicker. Because, 3 months, 6 months, a year, it's too late in this kind of world that we're living in and reporting it. Anyway, I've found this fascinating with lots of things to take away from this, relatively short discussion. And on behalf of all our panelists, I thank you for your attention and for your questions. Thank you.
Purposes of my work, I'm a lot more confident how we in my business use social networking today than even a year ago, even 9 months ago. I think things have changed in our world, just like it's changing in yours. And the impact we can have and we should have, and the impact you have and you should have, has changed as well. In a moment, I'll give you one quick anecdote, but trust me, I could give you many more. We've all watched, witnessed the Arab Spring. It'll come up, I'm sure, in this panel, and it may well have come up already this morning. Unfortunately, I missed the first half of the morning. How it's crossed parts of North Africa and many parts of the Middle East. We've all watched how social networking has helped organize crowds, monitored rallies, witnessed government excesses in response to those crowds, and outed those excesses to the world. But let me tell you about the journalism, which has changed dramatically in the coverage of this story in just the last 9 months, especially since the revolution in Egypt. You know, initially journalists were operating as they often do on big stories, independently of each other, especially with the use of social media. And that created traps. Rumors circulated, errors got in stories, people and news organizations got used. In our world, rumors can have incredible currency on and use the picture as proof. Now, you know what happens when that happens. Other news agencies, not all of them, but other news agencies will start to report on the same thing using the original source, the first news agency, as authenticity. And then it starts to spin almost out of control to the point where within a few days nobody's relating to the original source, they're just saying it as fact. Well, that's not what happened here. And it's interesting to learn from what happened here. When that report came out, and when that picture was being circulated, a fellow by the name of Andy Carvin, he's a journalist with NPR, National Public Radio in the United States, who has a great deal of respect by other journalists in different parts of the world who monitor his work, listen to what he has to say. He started wondering about this picture and trying to figure out whether or not he could authenticate it, because it was unclear to him whether or not that was the Star of David, or even what kind of weapon it was. So what did he do? He put it on his Twitter feed, and he encouraged his followers to analyze it and let him know what they thought. Now, this isn't any journalist. This is a fellow who is followed by, I checked last night, over 55,000 people. A wide array of, listeners, viewers, readers, other journalists. My name is Peter Mansbridge. I'm with the CBC. Good morning. It's great to be here, and I'm glad you're all along, and I thank Jim for the invitation to join you for this discussion, which I'm very much looking forward to. Before I introduce our panelists, let me try to introduce the topic to you by telling you a few things about my world that border on what is clearly a fascinating subject. And also that I have a strong belief in the idea of this panel, that in fact social media has profoundly altered how people, and especially those in my profession, interact with politics, government, policy development, and the coverage of issues that impact everyone. I think it's obvious that we all agree that the social networking world has been groundbreaking. It's used by millions, if not billions. But in spite of its benefits, it is full of pitfalls that it should be treated very carefully, and journalists should be, at the very least, wary of the information that often they are seeing, especially in fast-moving stories that impact our world. Now, those are important caveats, and obviously they shouldn't be ignored. But I can stand here today and tell you that I'm, for the purpose, but also people like you, policy wonks, think tank, analysts, people who write on the issues that he was covering. And within a very short period of time, this army of followers were offering all sorts of insight, not just the odd, no it isn't, yes it is, but analysis of the picture, of the weapon, of the issue, and getting it to him. In the end, he was able to conclude that this was not a weapon made in Israel, that it wasn't a Star of David, that in fact it was a camel, and it was from India. So think about that for a moment. For Andy Carvin, those were well-informed people who were tapped into for research on a fast-moving story in another part of the world. Watching Carver work that day was, for the journalists who were monitoring his work, was like being in the engine room of a major news organization at its best. On that day, Twitter let you learn, it let you observe, and you were better informed. So that, through a little anecdote, is my take on how the world is changing. Sure, it's a bit simple, perhaps, but think about the impact. Fortunately, the blend of rumors with facts tends to blur things. People tend to believe what they hear on the street corner and move it on. But sometimes we actually do learn in my business. And instead of ignoring the new world, we, I believe, have adapted to it and are using it to great advantage. Now, and I believe this especially on the part of the best journalists in the world, there's a kind of unwritten deal to ensure accuracy, to challenge the authenticity of, in the case I'll give you, of a tweet, and take it to the next level. Now here's the example. A few months ago, in the kind of middle of the Libya story, assuming we've almost reached the end of the Libya story, which is a dangerous assumption, I would vouch. But a couple of months ago, there was kind of buzz out there, and some of it was hitting the different feeds, that the Israelis were supplying the Libyans, the Gaddafi forces, with weapons, and in particular a special weapon they could use against the insurgents. There was even a picture out there that people were studying, trying to understand whether this was true. And the picture was of a weapon that seemed to have something stamped on the side of it, and it looked like Star of David. Some people were kind of leaping to conclusions based on that, but certainly the word was out there and being talked about. And then one Middle East news agency in Lebanon actually reported as fact.